All of a sudden, you see it's raining and it's dark.
Everyone noticed the blue sky was replaced with darkness.
Because they could see the airport, they really didn't factor in the severity of the weather. The air traffic controllers didn't really see what the crew was seeing on the airplane. And because of that lack of information, that may have been the difference in getting the crew to abort the landing sooner rather than later.
It's been 30 years since the world of weather and aviation was rocked by the deadly Charlotte plane crash of US Airways Flight 1016. This week on the Carolina Weather Group, we go into the archive and talk with my WCNC Charlotte colleague Nathe Morabito, who on the 25th anniversary of that crash joined the Carolina Weather Group alongside Chief Meteorologist Panovich to explain how that crash forever changed the world of aviation and weather. That's coming your way in just a moment. But first, I'm James Brierton, and I'd like to extend a personal invite to you to join me Saturday at the Shield Museum in Gastonia for their annual weatherproof event. From 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. in the afternoon, we'll be there along with other fun weather activities, including the National Weather Service Greenville Spartanburg, and Frank Strait and Melissa Griffin will be there from the South Carolina Climate Office. So that starts at 10 a.m. on Saturday in Gastonia, North Carolina for the Shield Museum of Natural History's annual weatherproof event.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Carolina Weather Group. This is the Wednesday, July 31st, 2019 edition of our little weather get-together. Tonight is show number 286. And tonight we're going to be talking about 25 years later after the USAir Flight 1016 had a tragic accident just outside of the Charlotte Douglas Airport. We have on with us tonight Nathe Morabito. He is investigative reporter with WCNC in Charlotte, North Carolina, as well as our good friend, Chief Meteorologist Panovich, also at WCNC in Charlotte, North Carolina. They're going to be joining us tonight. Nathe did a very well-done documentary that we're going to link onto our show, so you can check that out. But we're going to talk about Nathe with him about this interview that he has conducted with several of the families affected by this accident and what happened from the accident, what's come from the improvements there at the airport. So we're excited to talk about that. James, I'm going to toss it to you because sure. I know we're going to be rolling some video here in the next little bit, but
Nathan's going to talk to us in just a moment. I want to start by kind of setting the scene, and I'm going to let him do that as well here too. He produced a documentary earlier this month for WCNC television here in Charlotte, North Carolina, the Tegna-owned NBC affiliate. And Scotty and I were talking, and when we took a look at this documentary, we realized even as weather geeks, this provided a backstory that we were crucially missing. So you may already know at home, or maybe you don't, that Charlotte has what they call a terminal doppler radar, and it's used primarily for airport operations. And we'll get a little bit into that. But we knew that the reason that came about was because of a plane crash, but I had never really thought much about it beyond that. Well, Nathan has a lot of those answers because he dug into them for a documentary that is available now on the WCNC NBC Charlotte YouTube channel. And we want to show you just a short portion of it.
It was a hot, sunny day. Well, it was a hot day.
It was summertime, hot.
When we were cruising at altitude, it was clear blue sky.
All of a sudden, you see it's raining and it's dark.
Everyone noticed the blue sky was replaced with darkness.
Tremendous amount of rain, winds that could be over 100 miles an hour.
Pilots got lulled into a situation where, because they could see the airport, They really didn't factor in the severity of the weather. The air traffic controllers didn't really see what the crew was seeing on the airplane. And because of that lack of information, that may have been the difference in getting the crew to abort the landing sooner rather than later.
And joining us now, the creator and reporter behind this documentary, Nathe Morabito, who is on WCNC's Defenders team, the investigative team at the station. Nathan, thanks for coming on. Appreciate you taking time. Just tell us a little bit here as we continue to set the picture for people at home. Why did you think this was an important story to tell?
Well, thank you all for having me, number one. So I was, in 1994, I was 13 years old, and I was here in Charlotte, growing up in South Charlotte. And I remember one weekend, a plane crash on the news, actually on WCNC, where I now work. And I remember being glued to this story because it seemed like the weather wasn't great that day. And this plane essentially crashed into a neighborhood, into a home, and is in 3 different pieces. So this was always with me, like this whole story from my youth, and I was always traveling up to upstate New York from Charlotte, flying to visit my family up there. And so as a little kid, it just always kind of interested me. So anyways, fast forward to really last year, we started kind of thinking about ideas for stories, and we realized that this was going to be the 25th year anniversary of Flight 1016. And it seemed especially important to our viewing area because this is a totally Carolina story. This impacts people mostly who perished from Columbia, where the flight originated, and then of course Charlotte, where the plane eventually crashed. And so it just really got us interested because it seemed to me, number one, such an important part of Charlotte's history. And then I would later learn, after talking to our executive producer, Nathe, that this was actually a major part of aviation history. So we started kind of trying to put the pieces together, and we reached out to our sister station in Columbia, WLTX, who helped gather some of the interviews as well. And everything that we were able to obtain just seemed too good to just put in a 2.5-minute story for the news. And it's so too important, really, because as you all know, like Charlotte has grown so much, people have come and gone. And we really thought that, number one, the survivor stories needed to be told, the people who passed away, their stories needed to be told. And then finally, what maybe most important out of all of this is what is going to be done in the future and what has been done since to make sure this never happens again. So when I talked to the families that were on this plane, we know that when this plane left Columbia, which is obviously just a short drive away from Charlotte, let alone flight, that the weather was great. I mean, it was a hot, typical Columbia summer day. They left, everyone was in a fine mood. And as they kind of started their approach to Charlotte, everything seemed normal. The pilot started the normal descent announcement, make sure you stay buckled as they prepare to land. And that's when it got really dark really quickly. And then the rain started coming, and the rain started pounding the windows almost sideways. And what they later realized, and they didn't know in the moment, is they were in the midst of a microburst. The pilots, according to the NTSB investigator that handled this crash, said that the pilots could see the airport. So since they could see the airport, they kind of were lulled into complacency that they felt like this could be a normal landing. And they were so low to the ground at that point, as you can imagine, because they're trying to land, that once they realized they're in the microburst, even though they tried to get out of it and increase their altitude, there was really no getting out of it. The wind coming down was just too strong. Obviously, the heavy rain was involved there, and it was all very quick. And the biggest takeaway from all of this is that while the viewers on television, if they were tuning in and if the news was on at that moment, which it would have been because it would have been 6 o'clock, 6:43, it probably was just wrapping up actually. What would have happened is you would have seen the radar because the TV stations in the region had the Doppler radar. And I guess if the control tower was watching the news, they would have seen the radar as well. But what was missing in the control tower at Charlotte Douglas Airport and so many other airports across the country was Doppler radar. So they really couldn't properly communicate what was happening. They couldn't tell the pilots what was above them because they just didn't have it in front of them. And of course, because of this crash, that all changed. But in the process, 37 people died. And when you think about a plane crash, there were 57 people on board. And if there's any kind of silver lining from all of this, it's that 20 other people survived. And when he talked to the federal investigator, what's especially critical to him is that the entire flight crew survived, because then they could put together exactly what happened. They could talk to the survivors, they could talk to the pilot, and they could talk to everyone else on the crew to find out what happened and really piece together this massive report that detailed so many mistakes along the way. But at the end of the day, Greg Feith, who is the former investigator on this case, said it really all came down to that Doppler radar missing link. If they were able to communicate what they could see on the radar, if they had the radar, perhaps the pilots could have either aborted their landing sooner, kind of gone around sooner, or kind of avoided the area for a little bit.
Very good, very good. So tell me what were the lasting impacts from this event? And maybe you touched on it a little bit, some of those changes that were made at the airports across the Carolinas from this event. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, let me start with something that I think impacts everyone. And that's like when you're on a plane and you think about a plane crashing, I generally don't think the chances of surviving are that great, right? It's like a fear of anyone. If the plane goes down, will I survive it? And there were some very small children on this plane. We interviewed one of them, actually. She was about 18 months at the time. She doesn't remember any of it, but she survived. And she wasn't buckled in at the time. I mean, she was in the middle seat next to her mother. Think about this. There wasn't even really internet back then, let alone requirements to have kids buckled in on the airplane. But there was also another kid on the airplane that was probably just a little bit younger that died. And really, there was no rhyme or reason to who survived and who didn't. I mean, there were a lot of people that just kind of moved seats. In certain seats, people died, and you could be right next to someone survived, and another person died. And so I think that was a big impact of this crash, is that the survivability aspect, the industry was able to kind of figure out ways to make sure and to improve seatbelt usage and to improve kind of the infrastructure of an airplane. So if it does crash, your chances are much better of surviving. And when you think about a plane crash too, number one, you have kind of this loss of cabin pressure, right? You're going down quickly, so the oxygen issue. You also have the actual crash impact, which is another way you can die. And then there's the explosion afterwards, which is the third way you can die. And from reading the report, there were people really impacted by all three of those things. And even the people that did survive just have lasting physical injuries because of it. And of course, we know so many people died, 37 people. That's the majority of the people on the plane. So that's number one. On the broader scale that impacts all of us, it really is this weather issue. And, I was talking to Larry Sprinkle, NBC Charlotte weatherman, who just couldn't get over the response nationally, the attention that this plane crash brought specific to weather. Because all of a sudden you had people like Dr. Fujita, who kind of created the scale, right, for tornadoes and wind, coming to Charlotte to try to get a better understanding of what happened in this case. You had national news outlets putting pressure as to why the radar wasn't there, and really even kind of questioning the TV stations. Why wouldn't you provide this information to the control tower? And because of this, Congress fast-tracked this Doppler radar technology and control towers across the country so that really a pilot can't fly blind anymore, because that's kind of what was happening. You could see what was going on in front of you, but you couldn't see what was going on above you. And if you can imagine the way Larry Sprinkle put it to me, once you're in it, you can't get out of it. And you all would know better than I would. Once you're in this kind of microburst and the wind is just bearing down an airplane, how in the world, and you're so low to the ground already, how in the world can you pull out of that?
Yeah, you got a great point. And I just want to, back it up a little bit and switch gears just a little bit and bring Brad in here since he joined us. And maybe Brad can explain to a lot of the folks at home just basically what is a microburst and how does it form it and what is its, its local effects on folks.
Yeah, microburst, especially in the Carolinas, is probably the number one form of severe weather that we get in the Carolinas in the summertime. And they're isolated. Microburst is essentially a downburst of wind coming out of the storm directly to the ground. And when it hits the ground, it fans out in all directions. And what people don't realize is, we get a lot of wind damage around here and people immediately go tornado, tornado, tornado. And I would say 9 out of 10 of these events that we get damage around here, it's a microburst. And especially in the summer, it's these wet microbursts, which are full of rain. And these things can have winds up to 150 miles an hour. I mean, and they are a huge hazard to aviation because, as Nathan was just talking about, once you're in it, it forces the plane to the ground. There's not enough power that you can generate, especially when you're landing or taking off, to get out of these things. They have about a 2.5 square mile area, 2.5 kilometers roughly. Area, because that's what gets the microburst name because of the size. If it's a larger area, it's called a macroburst. But really, any heavy downpour or any cumulus cloud that's developing with a rain shaft has the potential to produce one of these. And especially when we have dry air in the mid levels or cold air aloft, that cold air is heavy and dense, and it wants to come crashing back to the ground. And they're really, really dangerous to pilots on takeoff and landing. And it's interesting to hear Nathan talk about the story here. And this is long before I got here, but I worked in a previous market in New Orleans, and people remember there was a similar crash in 1989 or 88 down there, where a plane crashed on the levee down there outside of New Orleans airport. Same kind of thing. It's amazing to think about. Before we started thinking about the advent of Doppler radar and the ability to get this data, planes were crashing often because of these microbursts at airports.
Yeah, that's you bring up some really good points, and especially with the advent of aviation technology as time's going forward, not just with radar sites at airports, but also onboard radar systems on aircraft. And I'll bring in Ricky here to talk a little bit more about that, because Ricky enjoys flying small airplanes for leisure, and talk about some of the effects on wind shear with aviation, Ricky.
First thing you got to consider is the type of airplane, all right? So you got a large airliner, that's a large wing surface area. And just think of it like with a downburst pushing down on that airplane. It's basically what the wind is doing. So as the airplane's on final approach speed, it's coming in maybe 160, 170 miles per hour, depending on the type of airplane once again. So you're already at a slower than normal flight speed, a slower, kind of more unstable almost flight speed. And as you enter this downburst, think of it like a big, almost upside down U shape here, with the wind coming out one direction, the wind coming out the other side direction, and fanning out all around. As you enter that downburst, it's kind of odd because your speed is actually going to increase just a little bit. So you're coming in, let's say like at 80 knots, you're actually going to experience a little bit of that turbulence and then that increase in your airspeed. That's a little bit of a bad thing, though, because as you get that increase in airspeed, likely what's going to happen is the aircraft's going to climb a little bit. Then as you hit more of the downdraft and the horizontal winds coming through, you encounter the different types of wind shear. And as a result, now you're not getting so much wind on the front of the airplane, but now you're getting it on the tail of the airplane. And as that happens, you push down the tail of the airplane. What happens is the nose of the airplane goes up, and that causes a higher angle of attack, or what we call alpha in aviation. So as that happens, now your engine is basically fighting to climb you up while something is trying to push down on the aircraft at the same time. That's going to lower your airspeed, and you're likely going to get into a stall situation. So you kind of go from the aircraft being almost over speed or faster than it should be traveling to now way under what it should be traveling. And stalls, pilots practice stall recovery all the time. When you go through airline training, whether you're doing a private pilot license, whether you're doing a commercial license, all the way up to airline pilot licenses, you're always practicing stalls. And it's something you practice in both the power on and power off, takeoff and landing positions. But when you get into a stall, a lot of times when you're practicing these things, you're doing it a couple thousand feet up. You got altitude under you recover. When you're doing it, you encounter a stall at 300, 400 feet on approach to an airport. Chris, as you very well know, there's not going to be a whole lot of time to recover that aircraft.
No. If you don't have the aircraft configured in a way that gives you the maximum performance that you need, especially when you're on short final and you're getting that real critical stage of flight, and something extreme like that happens, unless you make rapid movements and do all the right things necessary, things could not turn out the way you hope for them to be. And that's why it's so critical to have good weather information, and especially with the airports, like I said, these days, and also aviation. Coming up in 2020, there's a mandate that will require all aircraft to have ADS-B technology, and that's going to allow the smallest Cessna or the biggest 777, A380 in the sky for the pilots to get live weather information all the time. And so that's going to just add to the protection in place to make sure pilots don't encounter these these bad weather events, especially during such critical phases of flight.
And if I could jump in there for just a second, I actually want to talk a little bit not only about the regulations that are coming, Chris, as you mentioned, but the ones that were in place at the time. And I'm going to read off screen a little bit from that NTSB report that was put together after this crash in particular. So just to set the picture here, 25 years ago, we think of the Doppler radar network we have now. At the time, 90 of 162 radars were being set up, in the process of being set up nationwide, but only 10 radars were functional on the day of the crash. One of those being the one in Colombia, the WSD-88R radar, which, as we know from talking on the show previously, is 77 nautical miles away from the runway. What this crash ultimately led to, if you are just joining us, was the federal government, Congress, fast-tracking a terminal Doppler radar here in the Charlotte area, which was not operational at the time of the crash. Reading a little bit more here from the report, all 47 airports identified to receive terminal Doppler radars were to be implemented by December of 1995, but the FAA was behind due to finding land for the site here in Charlotte. So they went from being 5th in line to being way further down the list to being 38th in line. So instead of finishing by March of 1993, which Nathan, if I'm not mistaken, would have been before the crash, they didn't get this thing installed until 1995. Is that right? I think Nathan may be shaking his head there.
I'm shaking my head. Yeah, 1994 is when the crash occurred.
Yeah. Brad, can you explain in layman terms, the Doppler radar, the terminal Doppler radar that we have is helpful, but it's not perfect.
Yeah, the terminal Doppler radars were implemented and installed for this exact reason, to basically cover the airport for microburst and wind shear detection. They're not really great at detecting precipitation per se, because they're small C-band radars, which is a frequency of radar that's a little weaker than the S-band radars that we think about at the Doppler radar sites, the 88Ds, which are at Greenville, Spartanburg, Columbia, Raleigh, and Blacksburg. So what happens is they go through something called attenuation. If you think about if you have satellite TV, you've dealt with rain fade, trying to get your satellite TV when you have a heavy storm over your house. Well, these smaller radars, these C-bands, are very susceptible to rain fade, attenuation. If there's a storm over the radar site or near it, the beam is not strong enough, the frequency is not at the level that it can penetrate that rain. So oftentimes when there's something over the radar, you can't see anything beyond it. But they are really, really good at detecting wind shear. And even the terminal Doppler over the Charlotte area, and in some cases, I think does a better job of detecting small microbursts and small wind shifts in the Charlotte metro area than the 88D down in Greenville, Spartanburg. The problem is we have some beam blockage with the radar in the northwest quadrant. I think it's like on the 270, 280-ish radial. There's actually a communication tower that is software blocked by the radar. And it's not dual pole like the current 88Ds are, and it's very weak. So, and as we were hearing tonight, this was intentionally, these radars were intended, or I should say, for the FAA to detect wind shear. They really weren't meant for weather reconnaissance for the Weather Service, but it's being used that way now to help kind of Band-Aid approach cover the Charlotte area and most of the Piedmont, which is in a huge radar hole for the 88Ds, which is a whole story we can get into.
And you kind of just did that perfectly, Brad, because that was where we wanted to go next, was this whole radar hole that we have across a large part of Western North Carolina. You are involved with another local weather group trying to fix that hole and try to bring, in addition to local media stations that are in the Charlotte market, a better coverage of radars to the area. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, this has been going on since the mid-1990s, which is kind of ironic that we're talking about this plane crash, because that's when we lost the Doppler radar at the Charlotte Douglas International Airport. The National Weather Service reorganized in the early to mid-90s, and due to political reasons, because of two powerful senators, one in South Carolina and one North Carolina, and none of them being from the Charlotte area, they relocated the Weather Service offices and Doppler radars in different locations. So think about this. In North Carolina, we know what a huge state it is. There are 3 Doppler radar sites in the state of North Carolina. All of them, all 3 of them, are on or east of I-95. Okay? That means the western 2/3 of North Carolina, there are exactly 0 Doppler radars in the state of North Carolina. South Carolina, which is a much smaller state, but from a population and geographic wise, from an aerial extent, has 3 radars, one in Greenville, Spartanburg, one in Columbia, and then one between Charleston and Hilton Head down in that area. So the western part of North Carolina, and really central and western North Carolina, has to be covered by radars in Raleigh, a radar up in Roanoke, Virginia, and Greenville, Spartanburg. So because those radars are so far away and the earth is curved, as the radar beam gets up to the Charlotte area and most of the western Carolinas, the beam is looking anywhere from 6,000 feet to as high as, like in the Salisbury area, it's like 13,000 feet. And these severe weather events, wind shear, downburst, hail, precipitation, tornadoes, all occur in the lowest part of the storm. So we have really poor coverage here. And what we've been trying to do since, I would say, the late 1990s, helped start looking at this, but it only took about 2012 with an unwarned tornado in the Charlotte metro area, in the Reed Creek area. And I know Ricky remembers this one very well. I was actually working that night at the station covering the storm. We had a tornado near the university area, UNC Charlotte, at 2:36 in the morning. And I remember exactly, tornado touched down and blew 2 kids onto Interstate 485. Their home was completely blown in, and there was no warning issued. And lack of radar coverage was one of the reasons that we were given that there wasn't coverage and there was no warning. What was ironic was the Raleigh National Weather Service office issued a tornado warning for Stanley County, which was their jurisdiction, which was 2 counties over, because one of the radar operators up there happened to be on the phone with his mom in the Charlotte area and lost the phone connection and knew there was damage occurring and issued a warning. But because he couldn't issue warnings for Mecklenburg or Cabarrus County, issued it for Stanley County. So it was a really interesting setup. And so that kind of brought awareness to this radar gap. And there was a pushback there between, back then, I'm not mistaken, this was right at the tail end of Libby Dole's tenure. We tried to get, some movement through the government and nothing happened. So cut to today, we've actually had a bill passed. One of the first bills that President Trump actually signed was a law to look at this problem with these radars. And basically the way the law was written was the Weather Service had to look at cities that had populations, I believe, over 750,000, or was it 500? I can't remember the exact number, but it meant cities that were large enough that didn't have a radar within 55 miles of their city center. The Weather Service was required to look at a fix. So they did, and the fix they came up with was to lower the beam height of 3 radars to 0.2 elevation instead of 0.5, which didn't solve the problem, but it basically allowed them to satisfy the requirements of the bill. So we kind of ran into a brick wall. And now we're working on a private-public partnership. It's called the North Carolina Radar Project. Eric Thomas at WBTV here in Charlotte, myself, Van Denton up at WGHP in the Winston-Salem High Point market, Chris White from the Foothills Weather Network, Action Network, their new name, I got to remember that, and Kevin Hartman up in the Triad area as well. We've been presenting this problem and solution to possibly put in 3 C-band radars, dual pole Doppler radars, to fill this gap using mitigation funds from Hurricane Florence, which we think is a possibility. But we've been presenting this to councils of governments in all 3 areas of the Western Carolinas to try to find funding. And we're getting probably the closest that we've ever been to getting this done, that I actually am somewhat excited, and we're going to continue working on it. And the next step is to talk to emergency management. I'm going to meet with some private sector people like Bank of America, Duke, and Lowe's to see if we can't get money to help maintain these. And actually tomorrow, Eric and I are meeting with Barron Services to talk about radar prices. So we're getting to the point where we might actually have 3 radars. And the whole goal of this is to put a radar in Hickory at the Hickory Airport, a radar at the Monroe Executive Airport, and one up in the Thomasville area. And these would be dual pole C-bands, 1 million watt radars. And we would have the data be completely public. Anybody would be able to access any TV station, the Weather Service, FAA, you at home on Radar Scope. Anybody could have access to this information. That's the key part of building this network out.
Exciting to hear. And I think there's some optimism there, especially when you said you're getting to a point where you're so excited about this and it's something that's been in the work for a very long time. Let's bring back in Nathan. So this documentary you put together as a part of the Defenders team, which aired partially on WCNC and is available now in its entirety on the WCNC Charlotte YouTube channel. You talked with some survivors. Miraculously in this crash, there were survivors. What was it like talking to those people? I'm curious if you could paraphrase a little bit of what it is they shared with you, but I'm also interested in knowing, as a reporter, what did you take away from those interviews, and what will you continue to carry with you as a human being after talking to those people?
So it's so interesting to me. And like in my life, I'm always a big believer in these small little decisions we all make that lead us to wherever we go. And that's kind of what I was left with after I interviewed some of the survivors, and WLTX interviewed some, and listened to all of their interviews, was that some of these people made decisions before that plane took off to switch seats. Even family members, a husband and wife, one person decides to take another seat and the other one's back there talking to some people. And because she chose to change her seat, she died and he didn't. And to me, that was just such a, I don't know, it just kind of gives me kind of a shivers a little bit when you think about it, especially in that specific case. The man I'm talking about, his name's Paul Calvo, who's in our documentary. His wife, Phyllis, passed away. And I just thought this was such a horrible way to find out your wife had passed away. He was in a coma for about a week. And when he came out of his coma, the first thing everyone told him was that we buried your wife yesterday. So, you know, you've been out of it completely for a week, and it's the very first thing you learn is that your wife didn't survive. And then you have this other man, Jason Sturkey, who was on the plane with his mom and his nephew. They're all pretty much kind of together, and he was kind of blown back a little bit. And because of that, and his seat stayed together essentially, because he stayed with his seat, he survived and they didn't. Like I guess their seats kind of came apart. And then just this mother and daughter just kind of blew me away. They were the very first people that I tried to interview, because I knew a baby survived this airplane crash, and it just was like, wow, how does that happen? And how do you live your life after doing that? I mean, do you have survivor's guilt? Do you make decisions based on the fact that, you know, you survived and other people didn't? And Denise Toney is the girl's name. She ended up coming back to Winthrop. She's from Columbia. She came back to Winthrop to go to school. And I guess she's probably 26, 27 now. And she just told me that she always feels like there was some kind of purpose, you know, the fact that she survived and that her mother survived too, because there was a kid that didn't survive, but that child's mother did. So, I mean, the families that were taken apart, both a mother and daughter who had just tried to go home for a last minute flight on a cheap ticket they got last minute to stay with family, ended up in this plane crash. And the little girl, flight attendant, found her after the plane crashed. And the mother couldn't see anything, but she could hear her baby screaming, crying. And then the mother kind of realizes that you're on the ground, and the flight attendant says, she's okay, she's right here, she's right here. You were in a plane crash, but she's right here. And so, yes, this little girl who can't remember any of it is kind of living with some of the impacts, but her mother, you know, had major survivor's guilt, had major PTSD, impacted her first marriage. I mean, lasting impacts. And of course, she's incredibly grateful, and she makes meaningful decisions now based on the fact she survived. But just knowing the fact that these people, based on the fact where they sat, and just think about that too. When you get a plane ticket, like I like to be in the aisle, for example. So I will always buy a plane ticket for the aisle seat unless I'm traveling with my family, and then they kind of get priority a little bit, and I sit wherever. But it really came down to where these people sat. At the end of the day, the front of the plane, the flight crew all survived it. You know, and this wasn't like a plane crash where it goes kind of straight down. This is more like kind of comes in like this, right? And it kind of skids into some trees, it hits a house, it breaks apart. And I think another thing that I took away from all this too is just kind of brings us back to the point that we're talking about this, is that from the federal investigation, no plane under the same circumstances should ever crash again, because there should be a warning ahead of time. And so to me, it's just so powerful to hear these people. And I hope you'll listen to it, because their stories are just incredible. From the little boys who started talking about, why can't we meet Jesus, just moments before the plane goes down, to the mother that survived, who can name pretty much every other person that passed away. Like, and she'll tell, well, I went to her daughter's funeral, or, Miss So-and-so, she was scared to fly, and that was her first flight ever. And then to consider that these people survived that plane crash, and it took some time, but they actually flew again. And this is just the most interesting thing to me. This woman that I interviewed, Cheryl Robinson, make sure I'm saying her name right. Yeah, Cheryl Robinson. She initially, Oprah wanted to interview her after this crash. Oprah, think about this, 1994. Who was bigger than Oprah? And she said, I wouldn't do the interview because I would have had to fly to Chicago to do it, and I was too scared to do it. And it took time, but now she's flying. In fact, she flew just a few weeks before we sat down and did the interview with her down in South Carolina. And same with some of these other folks as well. Jason Sturkey flew again as well. So I just think so much to overcome from all of this. And these human beings that totally had to put their trust in these pilots. And I think one of the pilots has spoken previously. We reached out to pilot in the first mate, neither would talk with us or responded. But you kind of put your faith fully in the people that are flying that airplane. And in that moment, nobody had control over what was going to happen next. They really couldn't have prevented it. I mean, there were some things they could have done potentially, but the radar wasn't there. That's the bottom line.
And Nate, this is a tough story to tell as a reporter, because if I recall from watching the documentary on at least more than one occasion, they get a little choked up. This is still very emotional for them 25 years later.
Well, as one person told me, told us, this is kind of the default setting. So, and I can relate to that. My father died suddenly a couple of years ago and unexpectedly. And whenever my mind is like kind of turned off, my default is thinking about the day that he died. And this is their default. They don't think about it all the time. But when they sit down and their mind kind of clears for a minute, it goes back to the plane crash. And I mean, think about, they're not talking about it all the time, but it's kind of internal. And then when they come and talk about it for the first time in years, particularly when there's a camera in front of them, I think it was therapeutic, number one, but I also think that it allows them to kind of show the true emotion of what that impact is. I mean, you just can't put into words what these people went through. And this is just a fraction of the people that survived. But I mean, only 20 people survived. And we interviewed 4 of them. So that's, 20% of the people that survived that. And just to hear the fact that they almost went into a dream state when it started crashing. They can't remember the crash itself. They just can remember the aftermath. It's just, to me, it's just, I would never want to live it. And I think they have so much strength to continue to be able to kind of somewhat put that behind them, but also use it in their daily life and not take their life for granted. And I'm just going to kind of close with this on this point. Paul Calvo, whose wife died, there's this one moment where he just, and you could tell he means it, man. He says, if you have a good spouse, give them a hug for me. And you could just tell, even though he's since remarried and, he's moved on with his life, he had such a tremendous loss. His son even committed suicide in the years after, dealt with major depression from it. So that stuff doesn't leave you. And I almost feel like, particularly nowadays, when there's so much media consumption, like we tend to forget about these big events. Like the Miracle on the Hudson was a huge moment in our aviation history, right? Thankfully, everyone survived it. But there's so many other plane crashes. Thankfully, there haven't been as many in recent years in the United States, but there's so many other that are just critical that we know about, number one, and we remember the people whose stories there are to be told. And then finally, the impact these crashes had, so that you and I and everyone else can now fly more safely because of this.
Nathan, we appreciate that very much. Folks watching and listening right now to tonight's show, if you're interested in watching this entire documentary, you can find it on the WCNC NBC Charlotte YouTube channel, which we've also linked on our Facebook and YouTube postings for tonight's show. It will be in the show notes for the audio version of tonight's show. And we also just tweeted a link to the documentary if you're joining us live.
Conversation with my WCNC Charlotte colleagues Nate Morabito and Brad Panovich. Brad still working on his radar project, and Nate continuing his investigations with the station. You can find the full documentary from 2019 linked in the description of this Carolina Weather Group episode. I'm James Brierton. Hope to see you Saturday at the Shield Museum, but for now, stay subscribed, stay safe, and stay weather aware. Talk to you again real soon. Bye-bye.